Well, hello again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back. This video is for AP World History for Skyline High School 2019-2020, and it's Key Concept 9.4 Economics in the Global Age. The curriculum reads, in a trend accelerated by the end of the Cold War, many governments encouraged free market economic policies and promoted economic liberalization in the late 20th century. This can be seen most clearly with, say, Ronald Reagan in the United States, Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, Deng Xiaoping in China, and Augusto Pinochet inside Chile. So, first off, is the United States. In the United States, underneath Ronald Reagan, there was a big push to try to deregulate and get the government out of the economic system altogether. Reagan was a very strict critic of socialism. He's got a famous quote. It's something like, the most dangerous words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. So the big idea with him was to try to get the government out of the economic system to the greatest degree possible. His policies ended up looking a lot like what we know as Reaganomics. The idea was that wealth would trickle down to the rest of the population if there was deregulation of private businesses by the government, large tax cuts, and cuts in government spending. The theory was that giving tax cuts to the wealthy would lead to the creation of more jobs and most of the money ending up in the middle or working class. However, while deregulation and tax cuts did happen, especially for the wealthy, large government spending cuts never materialized, leading to record budget deficits. The debate on the effectiveness of the policy still exists today. The idea for a lot of, say, American Republicans in the 80s was that, like, say, tax cuts would end up paying for themselves, which the budget deficits would show definitely did not end up happening. Paul Krugman, the Nobel winning economist, said that this has become a zombie idea inside the United States, that tax cuts will pay for themselves. And he says that's a zombie idea because it's just a wrong idea that keeps coming back to life. So anyway, the debate on this still continues today. In Great Britain, underneath Margaret Thatcher, there was a very similar policy. She wanted to lower taxes, deregulate businesses, and roll back some of the socialist programs inside the UK. She also oversaw the privatization of the utility industries in the United Kingdom. And in China, coming off of the somewhat draconian policies of Mao Zedong in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, Deng Xiaoping will eventually come to lead the Chinese Communist Party afterwards. So in 1978, his policies included decollectivization of agriculture, something that had been devastating in the Great Leap Forward, for example. He oversaw the creation of new stock markets, allowed private businesses, created these special economic zones where they could engage in capitalist policies and free market economic policies. All of this shifted the Chinese economy from a total command economy to a socialist mixed market economy, which is sort of what it still is today. Most people would not argue that China has entirely free markets, but they certainly seem to have some of that influence in certain areas. So, like, for instance, this is Shenzhen, one of the largest and most prosperous cities inside China today, which is one of these special economic zones that allows for capitalist production policies. Some critics have suggested that this has meant that there's capitalism inside the cities and communism inside the countryside. In Chile, the people had democratically elected a guy named Salvador Allende, but the United States had helped to engage in a coup of that government and install as the leader Augusto Pinochet in 1973. As the dictator of the Chilean junta, the military government, he enacted the liberalization of economic policies, pushing for free market reforms and privatization of many government programs, except for, for instance, copper mines, which were really important for Chile's economy and still are today. While the GDP of Chile rose, critics point out that these policies led to greater inequality and poverty for greater portions of the country, that division between the wealthy who get wealthier and the poor who get poorer, and so on. Although the economist Milton Friedman continually pointed to Chile as perhaps an example of a success story where economic growth eventually led to democracy, as Chile was democratically ousting Augusto Pinochet later. But anyway, this here is the Chilean economic miracle, where they saw greater growth than the rest of Latin America. In the late 20th century, revolutions in information and communications technology led to the growth of what are called knowledge economies in some regions. While industrial production and manufacturing were increasingly situated in Asia and Latin America, a good example for this is what are known as the Asian tigers, the places in East and Southeast Asia where they began to engage in a whole lot more manufacturing. So Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And there was lots of manufacturing of just a lot of stuff. In the 1980s, 1990s, it was a lot of stuff like textiles and clothing, shoes and hats, and a lot of that type of stuff. In Latin America, partially as a response to the end of the Bracero program, was the maquiladoras, the textile manufacturing industries that developed in northern Mexico. The areas with the knowledge economies are like, for instance, Finland, Japan, and the United States. A knowledge economy is an economy in which growth is dependent on the quantity, quality, and accessibility of the information that's available rather than the means of production. So, like, for example, in Finland, they have a massive corporation known as Nokia that produces electronics and cell phones, and a lot of those advances are responsible for increases in the economy of Finland. In the case of Japan, Sony is really important, for example. Or in the United States, there's just a whole huge series of industries that are collectively known as Silicon Valley, in particular in California, in the Palo Alto area. Apple Incorporated, for instance, is one of the wealthiest corporations on the planet today, and they are continually making advances in cell phone technology, electronics in general, computers, video editing software, and so on. In Asia, Vietnam has become increasingly a very important center for manufacturing. Take a look at your shoes. Look at the tags. Probably a lot of them are manufactured in Vietnam. In Bangladesh, increasingly, the textile industry has become important. So production of t-shirts and jeans and just clothing in general. In Latin America, in Mexico, there's a lot of manufacturing of televisions. Thanks to the North American Free Trade Agreement, there's a lot of manufacturing of different car parts and computers. And in Honduras, which we're seeing here, there's manufacturing of, like, say, cigarettes, textiles, chemicals, and transportation equipment. Changing economic institutions, multinational corporations, and regional trade agreements reflected the spread of principles and practices associated with free market economics throughout the world. Two of the biggest institutions on the planet that really try to advocate for free market economics globally are the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which were created partially at the end of World War II with what's known as the Bretton Woods Agreement. You should have read about that in your chapter. Additionally, the World Trade Organization is one of the largest global organizations that tries to keep down limits between trading in between nations. International agreements have been created to try to limit barriers to trade between nations. The North American Free Trade Agreement is an example. I can't show you their website anymore because the Trump administration is wanting to renegotiate this right now. In Southeast Asia, there's the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. In South America, there is, say, Mercosur. You can click on these provided links. These are good sources of information. If you're looking for some of those reliable, high quality sources of information, these are some of them right here. Next up are multinational corporations. This is not new for us, but what is important and new for us in this unit is how big and how powerful a lot of multinational corporations have become. You know, for so much of AP World, we've been talking about how important and powerful states are. And it's almost always like we're talking about states, you know, the different countries that are fighting against each other and that kind of stuff. One of the things that's really important to note in the contemporary era is how big and powerful and wealthy multinational corporations have become. Some of these multinational corporations are quite a lot bigger and powerful and more wealthy than some of the governments on planet Earth. So, like for instance, Nestle, Nissan, Mahindra and Mahindra, Apple. You know, Apple has a lot more wealth and a lot more international influence than, for instance, say, the government of Uganda or something like that. Anyway, so of course we always want to have their side of things too. Please spend some time looking through their information. Rights-based discourse challenged old assumptions about race, class, gender, and religion. Remember, this is the foundation of what Enlightenment philosophy was built upon. This idea that like human beings have fundamental rights and that it's the duty of the government to protect them. Those are some of the basic ideas that the United States is built upon. So at the end of World War II, when the United States is working together with the Soviet Union and the victorious side of the Second World War, they eventually created the United Nations, and the United Nations ended up being very much influenced by this idea of human rights. And part of that is because of this lady here, Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, we talk a lot in the United States about Franklin Roosevelt, but I mean, there's no doubt Franklin Roosevelt is a huge and very important figure in American history, but in world history, Eleanor Roosevelt might end up being even that much more important. And part of that is because of her influence in creating the United Nations Declaration of Universal Human Rights. So this is the Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations. And a lot of this should, again, remind you of the Enlightenment philosophy that we've been talking about for a long time. Everybody has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. No one shall be held in slavery. No one should be subject to torture or cruel and unusual punishment. Everyone has a right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. No one should be subject to arbitrary arrest and stuff like that. You know, this is, in the end, one of the most important documents that's ever been created. And there's a very good chance that you'll see something from this on your AP World History exam. So be prepared for it. And so the point is that a lot of discussions and international discussions became built around this idea of human rights and protecting human rights, which is, again, part of what the United States was founded upon. In much of the world, access to education as well as participation in new political and professional roles became much more inclusive in terms of race, class, gender, and religion. One of the examples of this is Malala Yousafzai, who's put so much effort into trying to promote education for girls, for instance. Here she is advocating for the idea that it's the right of every child, and especially for girls, to get an education. Ladies and gentlemen, that's key concept 9.4. I'll see you in the next video.